The sun was a warm, gentle blanket over the small, quiet town. In a little house at the very edge of it, where the neat sidewalks gave way to a dusty country road, an old woman was in her garden. Her name was Eleanor, and she had lived in this house for more than 50 years. The house itself was simple, painted a soft white with green shutters, but it was the garden that was her true masterpiece. It was a tangle of color and life, with roses climbing the trellis, rows of bright zinnias standing at attention, and a small vegetable patch that always produced more than she could ever eat. At 70, Eleanor moved a little slower than she used to. Her back ached sometimes if she stooped for too long, and her knees would give a little creak of protest when she stood up. But in her garden, none of that seemed to matter. The rich smell of the earth, the feel of the warm soil in her hands, and the quiet company of the buzzing bees made her feel strong and peaceful. This was her kingdom, and she was its contented queen. Today was a perfect day for puttering. The sky was a clear, cloudless blue, and a light breeze kept the midday heat from becoming too much. Eleanor was on her knees wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat to shield her face, carefully pulling the small, stubborn weeds that insisted on growing between her prize-winning rose bushes. She hummed a soft old tune, something her mother used to hum to her when she was a little girl. The melody was a ghost of a memory, but it felt right, like it belonged in the garden just as much as the roses and the sunshine. Her world was a small, predictable circle of pleasant routines. There was the morning coffee on the porch, watching the world wake up. There was the mid-morning walk to the mailbox, a slow, steady journey to see if there were any letters from her grandchildren. There was the afternoon spent in her garden, and the evening spent with a good book and a cup of chamomile tea. It was a life that some might have called boring, but to Eleanor it was a life that had been carefully polished, smooth by time, like a river stone. It was comfortable. It was safe. As she worked, she was lost in thought, planning what she would make for dinner. Perhaps some of the fresh tomatoes from the vine, with a little basil and some mozzarella cheese. It was simple, but it was her favorite kind of meal. The loudest sounds in her world were the cheerful chirping of the sparrows at the bird feeder she kept full, the distant drone of a lawn mower from a neighbor's yard, and the rustle of leaves in the big oak tree that shaded her front lawn. It was a symphony of peace, a soundtrack she had come to know and love over the decades. So when a new sound cut through the quiet, it felt like a splash of cold water. It was a faint hiccuping sob. At first she thought it was a bird, maybe a young one that had fallen from its nest. She paused her work, her gloved hands hovering over the soil, and tilted her head to listen. The sound came again, and this time she knew for sure. It wasn't a bird. It was the sound of a child crying. The sound was small and thin, carried on the breeze, and it was filled with a kind of fear that made Eleanor's own heart clench. She straightened up slowly, her hand going to the small of her back as a familiar ache settled in. She squinted, her eyes scanning the road that ran past her property. The road was mostly empty, just a ribbon of gray asphalt shimmering in the heat. Then she saw him. At the very edge of her yard, where her lush green lawn met the dusty gravel of the shoulder, stood a little boy. He was all by himself. He was just a tiny figure, no taller than her rose bushes, and he looked completely out of place in the quiet landscape. He was standing with his back to her, his small shoulders shaking with the force of his sobs. He wore a bright red t-shirt, the color so vivid it seemed to vibrate in the afternoon sun. He had on a pair of blue shorts and small sneakers that were scuffed and dirty. He was holding something in his hand, a small toy, but he was clutching it so tightly she couldn't make out what it was. Eleanor felt a wave of protectiveness wash over her. She had been a mother, and she was a grandmother, and that sound of a child in distress was something that bypassed all thought and went straight to the heart. She looked up and down the road again, expecting to see a frantic parent running towards him or a car slowing down. But there was nothing. The road was empty in both directions. The only other sign of life was a hawk circling high in the vast blue sky. The boy was alone. Truly alone. Eleanor took off her gardening gloves and placed them neatly on the stone bench beside her. She brushed the dirt from her hands onto her apron. She knew she had to be careful. A child that young, scared and crying, might bolt if a stranger approached too quickly. She thought about calling out, but she didn't want to frighten him. Instead, she began to walk. She didn't walk directly towards him. She moved at an angle, as if she were just heading towards her own front door, her steps slow and deliberate. The grass was soft under her worn-out sandals. The boy hadn't noticed her yet. He was still facing the road, as if he were expecting someone to appear from around the bend. His crying had quieted a little, but he was still letting out these small, heartbreaking hiccups of air. Eleanor could see now that his face was smudged with dirt and tear tracks. His hair was a mess of dark curls, damp with sweat. He looked so small and vulnerable, a bright red spot of trouble in the middle of her peaceful world. She was close now, only a few feet away. She could hear his shaky breathing. She stopped and spoke, her voice as soft and gentle as she could make it, like she was trying not to scare a fawn. "Hello there, little one," she said. The boy jumped, startled by the sound. He spun around, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of fear. He had the biggest, brownest eyes Eleanor had ever seen, and they were swimming in tears. He took a step back, away from her, clutching his little toy even tighter. Eleanor stopped moving. She gave him a warm, gentle smile, the kind she used for her own grandchildren when they had scraped a knee. She didn't come any closer. She just stood there, a non-threatening presence in her own yard. "It's all right," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You're not in any trouble. I was just doing some gardening and I heard you." "Are you lost?" The boy just stared at her, his lower lip trembling. He didn't say anything, just nodded his head once, a tiny, jerky motion. That small nod broke Eleanor's heart. He was just a baby, really. Far too young to be all by himself on a road. She could see the fear in his eyes. A wild, panicked look that no child should ever have. She thought of all the terrible things that could happen to a little boy on his own, and she pushed those thoughts away. He was here now. He was safe. "Well, you're safe now," she said, keeping her voice soft. "My name is Eleanor. What's yours?" He just looked at her, his eyes still wide and scared. He didn't answer. Eleanor decided to try a different approach. "That's a very nice red shirt," she said, trying to make conversation. "It's my favorite color." He looked down at his shirt, then back up at her. The panic in his eyes seemed to lessen just a tiny bit. He still didn't speak. Eleanor decided to take a small risk. She slowly, very slowly, lowered herself to the ground, sitting on the grass in front of him. It made her seem smaller, less intimidating. She folded her legs underneath her and rested her hands in her lap. "See?" she said with a little smile. "I'm just going to sit here for a minute. The grass is nice, isn't it?" The boy watched her, his breathing starting to slow down. He could see that she wasn't a threat. She was just an old lady sitting in her grass. He took a small, hesitant step towards her. "My mommy," he whispered, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "My mommy's gone." The words were like a little dart to Eleanor's heart. "Oh, honey," she said softly. "I'm sure she's looking for you right now. Mommies always do. They never, ever leave their little ones on purpose." She looked at the toy he was clutching. It was a small yellow dump truck, well-loved and worn smooth in places. "Is that your truck?" she asked. "It looks like a very good truck. A hard-working truck." He looked down at the truck in his hand. He seemed to relax a little more, his focus shifting from his fear to his toy. "It dumps rocks," he said, his voice still a whisper. "Well, that's a very important job," Eleanor said, matching his quiet tone. "My name is Eleanor," she said again gently. "What should I call you?" He looked at her for a long moment, his big brown eyes searching her face. He seemed to be deciding if he could trust her. Finally, in a voice that was barely more than a breath, he said, "Leo." "Leo." It was a good, strong name. "Leo," Eleanor repeated, giving him another warm smile. "That's a fine name. It's very nice to meet you, Leo." She looked at his dirty, tear-streaked face and his small, trembling body. She knew he was probably hungry and thirsty, and more scared than he had ever been in his short life. The quiet afternoon she had planned was gone, replaced by this unexpected and very important interruption. And she wouldn't have had it any other way. "How about this, Leo?" she said, her voice full of kindness. "I was just about to go inside and get a glass of lemonade, and I just so happened to have some cookies, chocolate chip. They're my grandson's favorite. Would you like to come inside and have one with me? Then we can figure out how to get you back to your mommy." Leo looked from her face to the front door of her house. He was still scared, but the promise of a cookie and the kind, safe feeling of this old lady was starting to win out. He gave a small, hesitant nod. Eleanor felt a wave of relief. She held out her hand, palm up, not grabbing, just offering. "Okay then," she said. "Let's go." Leo took one last look down the empty road. Then he took a small step forward and placed his tiny, dirt-smudged hand into hers. It was the smallest hand she had ever held. and it felt like the most important thing in the world. Together, the old woman and the little boy walked across the lawn, leaving the empty road and the quiet afternoon behind them, and stepped into the cool, safe shadows of her house. The little boy's hand was so small in hers it felt like holding a tiny warm bird. Eleanor led him slowly across the lawn, her steps measured and calm as if she were guiding a skittish fawn. She didn't rush him. She could feel the slight tremor in his fingers, a silent echo of the fear that had held him captive just moments before. As they reached the cool shade of her porch, he hesitated, looking back at the empty road one last time as if hoping his mother might suddenly appear there. "It's all right," Eleanor said softly, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "We're just going inside for a minute. Everything is going to be okay." She pushed open her front door and the familiar, comforting smells of her home wrapped around them like a hug. It was a mix of old wood, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet scent of the roses she kept in a vase on the hall table. The house was quiet, filled with the soft, filtered light of the afternoon. It was a world away from the bright, scary emptiness of the road. Leo's eyes grew wide as he stepped inside. He seemed to be taking everything in, the pattern on the rug, the old photographs in wooden frames on the wall, the grandfather clock in the corner that ticked a steady, reassuring rhythm. He let go of Eleanor's hand but stayed close to her leg, his small fingers clutching the fabric of her apron. "You can leave your truck right here on the little table if you want," Eleanor said, pointing to a small side table by the door. "He can rest while we have a snack." Leo looked at his beloved yellow truck, then at the table, and carefully placed it down, patting its roof once before letting go. It was a sign of trust, a small gesture that meant he was starting to feel safe. "Good," Eleanor said with a warm smile. "Now come on to the kitchen. That's where the good stuff is." Her kitchen was the heart of her home. It wasn't big or modern, but it was full of life and character. The countertops were a faded, cheerful yellow, and the windows over the sink looked out onto her garden. A collection of mismatched ceramic mugs hung from a wooden rack, and a bowl of fresh apples sat on the table, their skins shiny and red. Eleanor guided Leo to a small wooden chair at the kitchen table. "You sit right here and make yourself comfortable," she said. "I'll be right back." She bustled around the kitchen, her movements sure and practiced. She took a pitcher of cold milk from the refrigerator and poured a generous amount into a small, colorful plastic cup, one she kept for when her grandchildren came to visit. Then she opened the cookie jar, a big, round ceramic one with a picture of a rooster on the lid. The smell of fresh chocolate chip cookies filled the air. She took out 2, placing them on a small plate. As she worked, she talked to Leo in a low, soothing voice, not really expecting an answer, but just to fill the quiet with a friendly sound. "I made these this morning," she said. "My secret is a little bit of extra vanilla. It makes everything taste better, don't you think?" She placed the plate of cookies and the cup of milk on the table in front of him. Leo just stared at them, his eyes wide. He looked from the cookies to Eleanor as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. "Go on," she encouraged gently. "They're for you." He reached out a small, hesitant hand and took a cookie. He brought it to his mouth and took a tiny bite. The moment the chocolate and sugar hit his tongue, his whole body seemed to relax. It was as if the cookie was a magic key that unlocked the fear that had been coiled up inside him. He took another bigger bite and then another. He picked up the cup of milk with both hands and took a long drink, a small white mustache forming on his upper lip. Eleanor watched him, her heart swelling with a fierce tenderness. Seeing the fear leave his face, replaced by the simple, pure pleasure of a cookie and a glass of milk, was the most rewarding thing she had experienced in a long time. She sat down in the chair opposite him, not saying anything, just giving him the space he needed. She knew he had been through something scary, and the last thing he needed was a barrage of questions. He needed to feel safe, and he needed to eat his cookie. When he had finished the first one and started on the second, he seemed to become aware of his surroundings again. He looked at Eleanor, his brown eyes clear and focused. "Thank you," he said, his voice still small but much stronger than it had been outside. "You are most welcome, Leo," Eleanor replied. "It's my pleasure." He took another bite of his cookie, chewing thoughtfully. "I was chasing a butterfly," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out of him. It was blue. A very, very blue butterfly. Eleanor leaned forward, her elbows on the table, giving him her full attention. "A blue butterfly, you say? Well, that must have been a very special butterfly to be worth chasing so far." He nodded, his mouth full. It was the bluest thing I ever saw. It went over the fence and down the road, and I just kept running. I wanted to see where it was going. He looked down at his half-eaten cookie. Then I couldn't see it anymore. And I couldn't see my house either. His voice started to wobble a little. I tried to go back, but I think I went the wrong way. That happens sometimes, Eleanor said, her voice full of understanding. Especially when you're following a beautiful blue butterfly. It's easy to get turned around. She knew this was the moment. He was talking, he was calm, and he was starting to process what had happened. It was time to make the call. You know what, Leo, she said, standing up from her chair. I'm going to make a quick phone call. I have some friends who are very good at finding mommies and daddies. I bet they can help us find yours. She saw a flicker of anxiety in his eyes. Are you going to leave? He asked, his hand tightening on his cup. Oh no, honey, she said, shaking her head. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be right here in the kitchen with you. I just need to use the phone over there. She pointed to the old rotary phone that hung on the wall next to the refrigerator. It was a pale yellow, just like the countertops, and it had a long, curly cord. Leo watched as she walked over to it. He seemed to relax again, knowing she wasn't leaving the room. Eleanor took a deep breath and lifted the heavy receiver. She dialed the 3 simple numbers she knew by heart, her finger turning the rotary dial with a series of satisfying clicks. After a moment, a calm, professional voice answered. Sheriff's Department. What is your emergency? Hello, Eleanor said, her own voice calm and clear. My name is Eleanor Vance. I live at 124 Oak Grove Road. I have a little boy here with me. He says his name is Leo and he appears to be lost. He's about 5 years old, wearing a red t-shirt and blue shorts. She paused, listening to the dispatcher on the other end. Yes, he seems to be unharmed, just a little frightened. We're having some milk and cookies right now. No, I haven't seen any parents or any other cars. Yes, of course. I'll keep him right here with me. Thank you so much. She hung up the phone, the clatter of the receiver echoing in the quiet kitchen. She turned back to Leo, who was watching her with wide, curious eyes. Well, she said, walking back to the table and sitting down. I talked to my friends. They are very nice people and they are going to come and help us. They'll be here in a little while. Leo seemed to take this in. He finished his second cookie and drank the rest of his milk. He didn't look scared anymore, just tired. The adrenaline and fear had worn off, leaving him drained. He let out a big yawn, covering his mouth with his hand. Feeling a little sleepy? Eleanor asked. He nodded. It's been a big day, hasn't it? Chasing butterflies and eating cookies. That's hard work. She stood up and cleared the table, rinsing the plate and cup in the sink. She could hear the sound of a car approaching in the distance, a sound that was growing steadily louder. She knew it was them. She went back to the table and knelt down beside Leo's chair. Okay, Leo, she said softly. My friends are here now. They're going to help us find your mommy and daddy. They are very nice, I promise. You don't have to be scared. Just then, she heard the crunch of tires on her gravel driveway. A moment later, there was a firm but gentle knock on her front door. Eleanor gave Leo's shoulder a reassuring pat. See, that's them. Everything is going to be just fine. She walked to the front door, her heart feeling a little heavy. She had grown fond of this little boy in the short time he had been in her home. She knew that letting him go was the right thing to do, but it still felt a little sad. She opened the door to find a kind-faced deputy standing on her porch. He had a gentle smile and a reassuring presence. Mrs. Vance? He asked. I'm Deputy Miller. We got your call. Yes, that's me, Eleanor said, stepping aside. Please come in. He's right here in the kitchen. The deputy followed her into the kitchen. He saw Leo sitting at the table and his expression softened. Well, hello there, big guy, he said, his voice warm and friendly. I hear you've been on a big adventure. Leo looked at the deputy, then at Eleanor. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look scared. The deputy walked over to the table and knelt down, so he was at Leo's eye level. You know we've been looking for you, he said. Your mommy and daddy are very worried about you. They're on their way here right now. A wave of relief washed over Eleanor. They were coming. He was going to be reunited with his family. She watched as the deputy spoke to Leo, asking him simple questions, getting him to talk about the blue butterfly again. It was clear the deputy was good with children and he was putting Leo at ease. And just as the deputy was finishing up, they heard it. The sound of another car. This one much faster and more frantic than the first. It came speeding down the road, its engine roaring. and then there was the screech of tires as it skidded to a halt right behind the patrol car in her driveway. The front door of the car flew open before it had even stopped moving completely. A man and a woman burst out, their faces a mask of pure panic and desperation. They ran towards the house, their footsteps pounding on the porch. The front door was still open, and they rushed inside, calling out a name. "Leo, Leo, oh my God!" The woman's voice was a choked sob. The man was right behind her, his face pale and etched with a fear so deep it was painful to see. They stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, their eyes finding the little boy sitting at the table. For a moment, nobody moved. It was as if time had stopped. The world narrowed to that single silent moment of reunion. Then Leo slid off his chair. "Mommy, Daddy!" he cried, his voice filled with a joy and relief that was overwhelming. He ran towards them, and they collapsed to their knees, their arms wrapping around him in a desperate, fierce hug. They were a tangle of arms and tears and whispered words of love and relief. Eleanor stood by the sink watching them, her own eyes filled with tears. The man looked up at her, his face streaked with tears, his eyes holding a gratitude so profound it was beyond words. He carefully untangled himself from his family and stood up, walking towards her. He didn't say anything at first. He just took her hand in his and shook it, his grip firm and strong. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. You have no idea. You have no idea what this means to us." Eleanor just smiled, a simple, genuine smile. "He's a wonderful little boy," she said. "I was just glad I could give him a cookie." The woman, still holding Leo tightly, looked over at her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for keeping him safe." After a few more moments of heartfelt thanks, the family gathered themselves to leave. The man picked up Leo, who was now clinging to his father's neck, his eyes already drooping with exhaustion. As they walked to the door, Leo lifted his head and looked at Eleanor. "Bye, Eleanor," he said, giving her a small wave. "Bye, Leo," she said, her voice soft. "You be good, okay?" And then they were gone. The house was quiet again. Eleanor stood in her kitchen, the empty plate and cup on the table, a small reminder of the unexpected visitor. She walked to the front door and watched as the family got into their car and drove away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. The patrol car followed, and then her yard was empty again. The whole world seemed to let out a breath it had been holding. The excitement was over. The quiet had returned, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a quiet filled with the warmth of a good deed, a quiet that felt a little less empty, a little more meaningful. Eleanor closed the front door and went back to her kitchen. She picked up Leo's cup and plate and washed them, humming that same old tune from her garden. It was just a small act, a simple gesture of kindness. But for one little boy and his parents, it had been everything. And for Eleanor, it was a memory she would hold in her heart, a bright, shining moment in the quiet rhythm of her days. The days that followed fell back into their familiar, comfortable pattern. The sun continued to rise, the birds continued to sing at her feeder, and Eleanor continued to tend her garden. The event with the little boy, Leo, became a fond memory, a small story she would tell her friends over the phone or when they met for their weekly coffee. She would describe his big brown eyes and the way he had held onto his little yellow truck, and her friends would all agree that she had done a wonderful thing. But as the days turned into a week and then two, the memory began to soften around the edges like a photograph left in the sun. The sharp edges of the fear and the relief faded, leaving behind a warm, pleasant glow. Eleanor's world returned to its peaceful state. The house was quiet again, just the way she liked it. The only evidence that the little boy had ever been there was the memory of his small hand in hers, and the faint scent of chocolate chip cookies that seemed to linger in the kitchen. She had received a beautiful bouquet of flowers the day after it happened, with a simple, unsigned card that just said, "With our deepest gratitude." Eleanor had placed them in a crystal vase on her dining room table, and every time she looked at them, she smiled. It was a kind and thoughtful gesture, a perfect end to the story. She assumed the family was from out of town, just passing through on their way to somewhere else. The idea that she would ever see them again seemed unlikely. Life was a series of small passing connections, and this one, she thought, was one of the most beautiful. She was content with that. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the incident, Eleanor was in her living room dusting the old photographs on the mantelpiece. There was a picture of her and her late husband on their wedding day, their faces young and full of hope. There was a picture of her children when they were small, grinning with missing teeth. and there were pictures of her grandchildren, growing up so fast it made her head spin. As she wiped the frame of a recent picture of her youngest granddaughter, she thought about Leo. She wondered what he was doing. She hoped he was happy and safe, and that he was still chasing butterflies, but maybe a little closer to home this time. It was a nice, warm thought, and she filed it away with all the other small, pleasant thoughts that filled her days. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her lawn, Eleanor was sitting on her front porch swing, enjoying the cool evening air. She had a cup of tea in her hands and a light shawl draped over her shoulders. It was her favorite time of day, a time for quiet reflection. As she sat there gently swinging, she noticed a car parked at the far end of her road. It was a black sedan, and it was just sitting there, its headlights off. It was too far away for her to see who was inside, but it seemed out of place. Her road was a quiet one, used mostly by the people who lived on it. She didn't recognize the car. She watched it for a few minutes, but it didn't move. She shrugged, figuring it was probably someone who had car trouble or maybe a teenager looking for a quiet place to park. She didn't give it much more thought and went inside when her tea was done. The next day, the car was there again. It was in the same spot at the same time of day. This time, Eleanor felt a small flicker of unease. It was a strange coincidence. She mentioned it to her son when he called her that evening. "A black sedan?" he asked, his voice a little concerned. "Are you sure, Mom? Maybe it's just a realtor showing a house." "I don't think so," Eleanor said. "There's no for sale sign, and it's just sitting there. It's a little odd." "Well, just keep your doors locked, okay?" her son said. "It's probably nothing, but it's better to be safe." Eleanor promised she would, but she didn't really think it was necessary. This was her safe little world, her peaceful kingdom. The idea of any real danger felt foreign and unreal. But over the next few days, the unease began to grow. The black sedan, or a car just like it, continued to appear. Sometimes it was there in the afternoon, sometimes in the morning. It was always at the far end of her road, never directly in front of her house, but always there, a silent, watchful presence. The cars were always nondescript, black or dark gray and clean. They never had anyone getting in or out, at least not that she could see. It was a subtle, unnerving mystery. Eleanor found herself looking out the window more often, her eyes drawn to the end of the road. The quiet comfort she had always felt in her home was beginning to feel a little less secure. It was as if a shadow had been cast over her peaceful life, a shadow she couldn't quite explain. She started to notice other things, too. Once, when she was at the grocery store, she thought she saw a man in a dark suit watching her from the end of the aisle. When she looked again, he was gone. Another time, she was taking her morning walk, and a dark car slowed down as it passed her, then sped up and drove away. She told herself she was being silly, that her imagination was running wild. The world was full of strange coincidences, but the feeling of being watched, of being quietly observed, was hard to shake. It was a feeling that prickled at the back of her neck, a low hum of anxiety that was always there, just beneath the surface. Her simple, predictable routines were now tinged with a sense of mystery and a touch of fear. She still tended her garden and read her books, but a part of her mind was always on alert, always wondering, always watching. She didn't know who was watching her or why. All she knew was that her quiet little world had been disturbed, and she had no idea how to make it right again. The beautiful bouquet of flowers on her dining room table, once a symbol of a happy ending, now seemed like a part of a puzzle she couldn't solve. It was a connection to the little boy, a connection that now felt complicated and strange. She had done a simple act of kindness, and it had led to this strange, unsettling mystery. She had no way of knowing that this was just the beginning, that the quiet observation was a prelude to something much, much bigger. She had no way of knowing that her simple act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would soon culminate in a scene so extraordinary, so unbelievable it would feel like something out of a dream. The weeks turned into a month, and the strange, quiet surveillance continued. The black sedan was a constant, unwelcome fixture at the end of her road. Eleanor's initial unease had hardened into a low-grade chronic anxiety. It was like a toothache that you couldn't stop touching, a constant dull ache of worry that colored her every waking moment. Her peaceful kingdom had been breached, and she felt like a prisoner in her own home. She found herself changing her habits. She used to love leaving her windows open to let in the fresh air, but now she kept them closed and locked. She used to enjoy her evening walks, but now she stayed inside after dark, her curtains drawn. The simple joy she had found in her garden was tainted. Every time she heard a car on the road, her head would snap up, her heart pounding in her chest until she saw that it was just a neighbor. The mystery was a heavy weight on her shoulders. She had told her son about the man in the dark suit at the grocery store, and he had become much more concerned. He suggested she call the sheriff's department, but Eleanor was hesitant. What would she say? There's a car parked at the end of my road, and I think a man in a suit looked at me at the store. It sounded crazy. It sounded like something an old, lonely woman would imagine. She didn't want to be that person. She had always been self-sufficient and sensible. The idea of being seen as frail or paranoid was almost as bad as the fear itself. So she kept it to herself, a secret burden that she carried alone. She tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a government thing, some kind of survey or property assessment. Maybe it was a private investigator, and she was just a background character in someone else's drama. She ran through all the possibilities in her mind, but none of them quite fit. The feeling of being the focus of their attention was too strong, too personal. One afternoon, she was working in her garden, trying to lose herself in the familiar comfort of the soil and the plants. She was planting some new bulbs for the spring, her hands dirty, her mind focused on the task at hand. For a little while, she was able to forget about the car, about the feeling of being watched. She was just Eleanor in her garden on a beautiful autumn day. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the car pull up. It wasn't the usual black sedan. It was a different car, a dark gray SUV, and it was much closer. It parked right across the street from her house. Eleanor froze, her trowel in her hand. She looked up and saw the vehicle. It was parked there, silent and imposing, like a predator watching its prey. Her heart began to race. This was different. This was bolder. She watched as the driver's side door opened and a man got out. He was tall and dressed in a dark, well-fitting suit. He had a short, neat haircut and a serious, unreadable expression. He didn't look at her. He just stood by his car looking at his phone as if he were just waiting for someone. But Eleanor knew. She knew he was there for her. She felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She slowly stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. She didn't know what to do. Should she go inside? Should she say something? Her mind was a blank slate of fear. The man didn't move. He just stood there, a silent, sentinel-like figure. He was a clear, undeniable message. A message that said, "We are here. We are watching, and there is nothing you can do about it." Eleanor felt a wave of despair wash over her. This was her home, her sanctuary, the place where she had always felt safe and in control. Now it felt like a cage. She was a small old woman, and this man, this powerful, intimidating figure, had taken that feeling of safety away from her with just his presence. She gathered her gardening tools, her hands shaking slightly, and walked towards her house. She didn't look at the man, but she could feel his eyes on her. It was a physical sensation, a prickling on the back of her neck. She unlocked her front door and went inside, locking it behind her. She leaned against the door, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She peeked through the peephole. The man was still there. He hadn't moved. She went into the living room and peeked through the curtains. He was still there. He was a part of her landscape now, a dark, unwelcome monument to her fear. She didn't know how long she stood there watching him. It felt like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he got back in his car and drove away. But the fear he left behind lingered in the air, a toxic, suffocating presence. That night, Eleanor barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the leaves outside sounded like a threat. She had never felt so alone, so vulnerable. The next morning, the SUV was back. And this time it wasn't alone. The black sedan was there too, parked a little further down the road. It was a display of force, a clear and unmistakable escalation. They weren't being subtle anymore. They were making their presence known. Eleanor felt a surge of anger, a hot, fierce emotion that cut through her fear. Who were these people? What gave them the right to terrorize her like this? She was an old woman who had lived a quiet, decent life. She didn't deserve this. She decided she had to do something. She couldn't live like this anymore. She picked up the phone and dialed her son's number. "I need your help," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Something happened yesterday." She told him about the man in the SUV, about the way he had just stood there watching her. Her son listened patiently, his silence on the other end of the line more frightening than any angry outburst would have been. When she was finished, he didn't tell her she was imagining things. He didn't tell her she was being silly. "I'm coming over, Mom," he said, his voice grim. "I'll be there in an hour." Eleanor felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She wasn't alone anymore. Her son arrived with his wife, and they sat with her in the living room, a united front against the unseen enemy. They looked out the window at the two cars parked like sentinels on her quiet road. "This is not okay," her son said, his jaw tight with anger. "This is harassment." He wanted to call the sheriff to confront the men in the cars, but Eleanor stopped him. "No," she said. "I don't want to make things worse. I don't know who these people are or what they're capable of. But we can't just let them do this, Mom," her daughter-in-law said, her voice full of concern. "We have to do something." They talked for a long time, trying to figure out what to do. They were all at a loss. It was a situation so strange, so far outside the realm of their normal experience that they didn't know how to react. As they were talking, Eleanor's mind was racing, trying to connect the dots to find the missing piece of the puzzle. The cars, the man in the suit, the strange feeling of being watched. It all had to be connected. But to what? Then she remembered. The little boy, Leo, the beautiful bouquet of flowers, the anonymous card. It was the only thing that had been out of the ordinary in her life before all of this started. It was the only connection she had to a world outside of her quiet small town. "I think I know what this is about," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She told them about Leo, about finding him in her yard, about the reunion with his parents. She told them about the flowers. "What if his parents are important?" she said. "What if they're rich or famous or something?" Her son and daughter-in-law looked at each other, a dawning understanding in their eyes. It was a long shot, a wild, almost unbelievable theory, but it was the only one they had. It would explain the resources, the professionalism, the quiet, persistent surveillance. If Leo's parents were powerful people, they might have the means to do something like this. But why? Why would they be watching her? She had helped them. She had returned their son to them. It didn't make any sense unless they weren't watching her. Unless they were watching for something. Or someone. The thought sent a fresh chill down Eleanor's spine. She was caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. A story that was much bigger and more complicated than she could ever have imagined. The quiet observation was no longer just a mystery. It was a threat, and she had a sinking feeling that the final, breathtaking chapter of this strange story was about to begin. The next morning, the house felt different. It was no longer just her home. It was a fortress, a place of quiet tension. Her son had stayed the night, sleeping on the couch, a silent, reassuring presence. He had made her promise to call him the moment anything at all, seemed out of the ordinary. Eleanor felt a strange mix of fear and a grim sort of resolve. The mystery had a name now, a face, even if it was just the memory of a little boy's smile. She was no longer just a random target. She was a part of a story. And she was determined to see how it ended. The morning passed in a state of heightened alert. Every sound was amplified, every shadow a potential threat. The cars were still there, a silent, watchful presence at the end of her road. Eleanor tried to go about her day, to make coffee and read the paper, but her heart wasn't in it. She was waiting. She didn't know what she was waiting for, but she knew it was coming. It was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon when she heard it. It was a distant sound at first, a low, insistent wail that grew steadily louder. It was the sound of sirens. Not just one siren, but many. Her son was on his feet in an instant, his face grim. "Stay here," he said, moving towards the window. Eleanor followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound grew louder and louder, a symphony of approaching urgency. It was the sound of officialdom, of power, of something important happening. Then she saw them. A procession of police motorcycles, their lights flashing, came roaring down her quiet road. They were moving in a perfect synchronized formation, clearing the way for something or someone important. They were followed by a long, gleaming black limousine, a car so out of place in her simple neighborhood that it looked like it had driven out of a movie. It was flanked by several more official-looking vehicles, black SUVs with tinted windows. The entire motorcade came to a stop, not at the town hall or a local business, but directly in front of her small, humble house. They filled her entire yard, a sea of official cars and serious-faced men in suits. It was a scene so surreal, so unbelievable that Eleanor felt like she was watching it happen to someone else. Her son put a protective arm around her, his eyes wide with shock. "What in the world?" he whispered. Before Eleanor could answer, there was a firm, respectful knock on her front door. Her son went to the door and looked through the peephole. He turned to Eleanor, his face pale. "Mom," he said, his voice full of awe. "I think you should answer this." Eleanor took a deep breath, straightened her back, and walked to the door. She opened it, and there on her porch stood a man she recognized instantly from the television. It was the governor of the state. He was taller than he looked on TV, with a kind, weary face and a presence that filled the small space. He was flanked by two serious-looking men in dark suits, but his eyes were fixed on her. They were warm and filled with a genuine, deep-seated gratitude. "Mrs. Vance?" he said, his voice exactly as it sounded in his press conferences, but softer, more personal. "I am so sorry to disturb you. My name is—" He didn't need to finish. She knew who he was. "Yes," Eleanor stammered, her mind reeling. "I'm Eleanor Vance." The governor smiled, a warm, disarming smile that reached his eyes. "May we come in?" Eleanor stepped aside, her mind a complete blank. The governor of the state was asking to come into her house. It was the most surreal moment of her entire life. He walked into her living room, his entourage staying respectfully outside on the porch. He looked around her humble home, his eyes taking in the old photographs, the comfortable furniture, the vase of flowers on the dining room table. "You have a beautiful home, Mrs. Vance," he said. "It feels warm, like a home should feel." "Thank you," Eleanor managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "Please sit down." He sat down on her old floral sofa, looking completely out of place and yet strangely comfortable at the same time. Eleanor sat in the chair opposite him, her son standing behind her, a silent, supportive presence. "I'm sure you're wondering what all this is about," the governor began, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "The truth is, I've been wanting to come and see you for weeks. But my wife, well, she insisted that a simple thank you wasn't nearly enough." He took a deep breath, and for a moment he looked not like a powerful politician, but like a tired, worried father. "The little boy you helped," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "His name is Leo. He's our son." Eleanor felt a gasp catch in her throat. Of course, it all made sense now. The little boy with the big brown eyes, the frantic parents, the beautiful flowers. It was him. It was the governor's family. "We were at a retreat at a lodge about a mile from here," he continued. "It was supposed to be a quiet family weekend. Leo was chasing a butterfly in the garden, and in a split second he was gone. We were out of our minds with worry. The state police were everywhere. The whole area was in a lockdown. It was the worst hour of our lives." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. "And then we got the call. A woman named Eleanor Vance had found him. She had given him a cookie and a glass of milk, and she had made him feel safe." He shook his head as if he still couldn't quite believe it. "In a world that can be so complicated and so cruel, you showed us a simple, pure act of kindness. You didn't see a governor's son. You just saw a little boy who was lost and scared, and you took care of him." He stood up and walked over to her, taking her hand in his. "My wife and I and our entire family owe you a debt that we can never repay. You gave us our world back." Eleanor was speechless. Tears streamed down her face, tears of relief, of understanding, of a deep, profound joy. The mystery was solved. The fear was gone, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire being. All this time she had been worried, she had been scared. And all along it was just this. A family trying to find a way to say thank you. "We tried to do it quietly," the governor said a little sheepishly. "We had some people make sure you were okay, that you didn't need anything. We didn't want to intrude on your life. But my wife, she said that a quiet thank you wasn't enough for a woman who had done what you did. She said we had to come and thank you in person." He looked at her, his eyes sincere. "I hope you can forgive us for scaring you. That was never our intention." Eleanor shook her head, a watery smile on her face. "There's nothing to forgive," she said. "I'm just so glad he was okay. He's a wonderful little boy." The governor smiled. "He is. And he hasn't stopped talking about the nice lady with the chocolate chip cookies." He let go of her hand and walked back to the sofa. "There's one more thing," he said. "My wife and I, we wanted to do something to show our gratitude. Something that would honor the kindness you showed our son." He nodded to one of the men on the porch, who handed him a large, sealed envelope. He gave it to Eleanor. "Please," he said. "This is just a small token of our appreciation. For the cookies and for so much more." Eleanor took the envelope, her hands trembling. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she finally managed to whisper. "No, Mrs. Vance," the governor said, his voice full of sincerity. "Thank you." He stayed for a few more minutes, talking to her about her garden, about her life, treating her not like a hero but like an old friend. And then, with another warm handshake and a final heartfelt thank you, he was gone. The motorcade started up again, the sirens wailed, and just as quickly as it had arrived, it was gone. Eleanor stood in her living room, the sealed envelope in her hand, and looked out the window at her empty yard. The world was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a quiet filled with a sense of wonder, a quiet that felt bigger and more meaningful than it had before. She opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from the governor's wife, a beautiful, heartfelt letter that spoke of their gratitude and their relief. And tucked inside the letter was a check. It was for more money than Eleanor had ever seen in her entire life. It was enough to pay for her grandchildren's college educations, to repair her roof, to live without ever having to worry about money again. But as she looked at the check, she realized that the money wasn't the real gift. The real gift was the story. The real gift was the memory of the governor standing in her humble hallway, his eyes filled with tears. The real gift was the knowledge that a simple act of kindness, a cookie and a glass of milk, had rippled out into the world and had touched the lives of so many people. She looked out her window at her quiet street, at her beautiful garden. It was the same world it had been that morning. But to Eleanor it felt different. It felt brighter, more full of possibility. She was still just an old woman in a small town, but she was also a woman who had helped a lost child, a woman who had been thanked by a governor, a woman who had a motorcade in her yard. It was a story she would tell for the rest of her life, a story that reminded her that even in the quietest of corners, even in the simplest of lives, there is the potential for extraordinary grace. And as she stood there, a smile on her face, she knew that her quiet little world would never feel small again.